Ed Sullivan revealed the 7 most evil music legends in TV history. These are 7 music legends who helped shape American culture, but whose offstage behavior ranged from disturbing to criminal, and people around Ed Sullivan later claimed he wanted distance from them. In this video, we count down from 7 to 1, moving from the least severe case to the darkest, using only the names tied to those stories. For years, the Ed Sullivan Show was the biggest stage in the country. If Ed booked you, millions saw you, and your career could change overnight. But staff accounts suggest Sullivan wasn't only judging talent, he was watching character too, especially what happened when the camera stopped. Some stars were simply difficult. Others carried patterns that were far worse, involving exploitation, violence, or behavior that left a trail behind them. So today we're separating the performance from the person, starting at number 7, with the act that defied Sullivan on live television, and ending with the name linked to the most extreme outcome of all. Number 7. Jim Morrison, the poet who defied America's host. Number 7 starts with the case that happened right in front of America, not in a courtroom file or behind closed doors, but live on national television. In 1967, the Doors were invited onto the Ed Sullivan Show, and this was supposed to be the clean, respectable moment that proved they were more than just a wild psychedelic band. They were there to perform their hit Light My Fire, and Sullivan's team had one simple condition: change one line. The problem was a lyric that sounded like a drug reference. The original line was, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher." On Sullivan's family show, that wasn't acceptable. So Sullivan personally asked Jim Morrison to change it to "Girl, we couldn't get much better" for the live broadcast, and backstage, Morrison agreed. But when the cameras rolled, Morrison didn't change a word. He sang the original lyric anyway, and according to the standard account of what happened next, Sullivan was furious. After the performance ended, he refused to play along with the usual polite routine, and backstage he made a decision that was rare even for him. The Doors were told they would never appear on the program again, and they didn't. That moment became more than a lyric dispute. To Sullivan, it wasn't about creative freedom. It was about trust. In his world, if a guest gave their word, they kept it. Morrison's choice looked like a deliberate insult, a performer agreeing to the rules and then breaking them in the most public way possible, for attention, for rebellion, or simply because he could. And here's why Morrison makes this list. Even though his case isn't built around one clear criminal pattern like the others. What bothered Sullivan, at least according to people who worked the show, was the feeling that Morrison wasn't just rebellious, he was self-destructive, the kind of person who couldn't stop himself, even when it would cost him. That impression only grew stronger as Morrison's behavior became more erratic and his alcohol use worsened. Not long after, his reputation was shaped by yet another infamous scandal, the Miami incident, where he was arrested over allegations tied to his onstage behavior, a case that stayed controversial and contested. And within a few years, the pattern ended in the most tragic way possible. Jim Morrison died in Paris in 1971, at just 27 years old, becoming one of the most famous examples of a talent consumed by his own chaos. To Sullivan, Morrison wasn't simply a rock star testing boundaries. The defiance on live television looked like proof of a deeper flaw, not just in professionalism, but in character. So number 7 isn't the worst in terms of harm compared to the names still coming. But he was the first on this list to show Sullivan something important, that fame could amplify a person's darkness just as easily as it amplified their music. And from here, the list only gets more troubling, because the next legend wasn't banned for defying a lyric request. He was booked, censored, and publicly praised, but the concerns around him were tied to power, influence, and the uncomfortable way celebrity can pull young people into an orbit they don't fully understand. Number 6. Elvis Presley, the King's Controversial Court. Number 6 is the most complicated name on this list, because unlike most of the legends we're covering tonight, Elvis Presley wasn't known for a criminal record or a clear pattern of violence. What makes Elvis unsettling in this context is something else entirely: power, and the way that power shaped the people around him. Elvis's appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1956 and 1957 became some of the most important moments in television history. The reaction was explosive, the screaming, the hysterical crowds, the way young fans, especially girls, treated him like something more than a singer. For America watching at home, it was exciting. For Sullivan, according to staff accounts, it was also alarming. Sullivan initially resisted booking Elvis because of how provocative his performances were and the controversy they caused. But once Elvis had already proven he could pull huge ratings, Sullivan relented. Still, the show tried to keep tight control over what the audience saw. That's why one moment became legendary. During Elvis's final Sullivan appearance, the cameras filmed him only from the waist up, a clear attempt to censor the part of his performance that critics found too suggestive. It went down as one of the clearest symbols of the culture clash happening in the 1950s, the older generation trying to contain what the younger generation was embracing. But in the competitor account you're using, the deeper concern wasn't just Elvis's dancing. The idea is that Sullivan saw something troubling in the way Elvis's influence worked, how easily he could pull teenage girls into a kind of obsession. The show wasn't just worried about shaking hips. It was worried about what it meant when a grown man became the center of attention for millions of young fans who didn't have the maturity to separate fantasy from reality. And when you look back at Elvis's personal life, there are patterns that make those concerns harder to ignore. The most well-known example involves Priscilla Beaulieu. She began her relationship with Elvis when she was 14 years old, while Elvis was 24. They did not marry until later, when she was 21. But the age gap and the timing have been questioned again and again in retrospective discussions of his legacy. Priscilla later described a relationship where Elvis could be controlling, shaping things like her appearance and the way she lived. Biographers have also documented that Elvis gravitated toward very young women, often drawn to the idea of someone he could mold to fit his image. That wasn't something the public focused on in the moment, because Elvis's image was carefully managed and softened over time. In fact, Sullivan himself eventually praised Elvis publicly, telling the audience after one appearance that Elvis was a real decent fine boy, suggesting that, at least on camera, Elvis was being presented as safe and respectable. That's what makes this case so strange. Sullivan could criticize Elvis's image, censor his performances, and still end up endorsing him on air. But staff accounts say Sullivan privately held reservations, not about a crime that had been proven, but about a dynamic he felt was unhealthy: the imbalance between an adult star and the teenage girls who idolized him. So Elvis lands at number 6, not because he was the most openly brutal person on this list, but because his story highlights something darker about fame itself. Sometimes the damage isn't created by an obvious criminal act. Sometimes it's created by influence, by access, and by the way celebrity power can quietly reshape the lives of people who never stood a chance of saying no. And the next name on this list is the exact opposite of complicated. Because number 5 isn't a case of discomfort and retrospective debate. It's a case of documented legal trouble that followed a rock pioneer for decades and left Sullivan's team questioning whether musical genius could ever excuse what the man behind it was accused of doing. Number 5, Chuck Berry. Rock's pioneer with a prison shadow, number 5 is one of the most important architects of rock and roll, a man whose music helped build the entire language of the genre. But his legacy comes with a legal history that made it impossible to view him as simply a charming pioneer. Chuck Berry took the stage on the Ed Sullivan Show in the late 1950s, bringing a sound that felt brand new to American audiences. With songs like Maybelline, he wasn't just performing hits, he was showing the country what rock and roll looked like when it was still dangerous, still raw, and still very much the sound of teenagers breaking away from the older generation. Sullivan initially embraced Berry as an exciting new star. He had the guitar style, the swagger, and the kind of lyrics that made young people feel seen. But the relationship reportedly soured once more. Details of Berry's personal life and legal trouble became harder to ignore, and those problems weren't minor. Berry's history of serious legal trouble stretched back long before fame. Then, during the height of his popularity, he was arrested in 1959 for violating the Mann Act, accused of transporting a 14-year-old girl across state lines for immoral purposes. The girl had worked at Berry's club, and he allegedly brought her to St. Louis. The case ended with Berry being convicted, and he served 20 months in prison. That conviction alone was enough to stain his image permanently, especially in the world Sullivan lived in. Sullivan wasn't just booking a singer, he was bringing someone into America's living rooms, and anything involving minors, was a line that could destroy the trust his audience had in him. Barry returned to performing after prison, and musically, his influence only grew. His writing and guitar work shaped the future. Artists from the Beatles to the Rolling Stones drew directly from his style, and songs like Johnny B. Good, Roll Over Beethoven, and rock and roll music became foundational. But the problem was, the legal shadow did not disappear. Barry faced more trouble later in life too, including tax issues. And then came one of the most disturbing controversies tied to his name. In 1990, women filed a class action lawsuit claiming they had been videotaped in the bathroom of a restaurant Barry owned. The lawsuit was eventually settled, with reports placing the settlement around $1.2 million. That's what makes Chuck Berry such a complicated cultural figure. His artistic legacy is undeniable. He helped define rock music itself. Yet his personal conduct and legal trouble forced people to ask a question that still follows the entertainment industry to this day. What happens when the person who built the art also carries behavior that feels impossible to defend? Sullivan's team, according to later accounts, struggled with that contradiction. Barry could be brilliant on camera, but the criminal history was too ugly to ignore. It wasn't about being rebellious. It wasn't about rock and roll attitude. It was about actions that crossed into something far more disturbing. So number 5 is where the list starts to shift. This isn't just ego or defiance anymore. This is documented legal behavior that permanently stains a legacy. And the next legend takes us even deeper into that darkness, because number 4 wasn't only accused of wrongdoing. He was surrounded by stories of violence, control, and a reputation so intense that even the people who worked alongside him described a man who seemed to carry something dangerous inside. Number 4, James Brown. The Godfather's Dark Kingdom. Number 4 is James Brown, a man whose talent was so undeniable that even Ed Sullivan, rarely emotional on camera, praised him openly and called him the hardest working man in show business. On stage, Brown looked like pure discipline. Every move was timed. Every beat landed exactly where it should. To the audience, it felt like excellence. But according to backstage accounts tied to the show, Sullivan and his staff saw a side of James Brown that didn't match the smiling legend on television. The competitor framing is simple. Brown didn't just demand perfection. He demanded control, and he ruled his world like a kingdom. Band members weren't treated like equals. They were treated like property. Small mistakes could bring harsh consequences, and the competitor script highlights the infamous fine system, where performers were punished for things as minor as scuffed shoes or missed dance steps. The result was a band that performed like a machine, but the pressure behind those performances built an atmosphere of fear. Brown wasn't just difficult. He could be intimidating, unpredictable, and brutal. And the darkness didn't stop with workplace control. Brown carried a long trail of legal problems over the years. His record included arrests, including domestic violence involving different wives and girlfriends, along with weapons charges and drug possession. It wasn't a single incident that got exaggerated by gossip. It was repeated trouble that followed him through fame, and it became part of his reputation inside the industry, even when fans didn't want to hear it. The most disturbing part, though, was the repeated abuse allegations from women close to him. Several wives and girlfriends later described violent behavior. The competitor script emphasizes his third wife, Adrienne Lois Rodriguez, who filed for divorce and filed assault charges against him, then reconciled. Their relationship became one of the strongest examples of the contradiction in Brown's life. A man celebrated publicly as a genius, while privately accused of terrifying conduct. Rodriguez later died in 1996, after complications following cosmetic surgery. While her death was not presented as a proven crime, it became another piece of the tragedy surrounding Brown's personal life, and it added to the sense that behind the glittering career was a man surrounded by chaos. This is why Brown lands at number 4. In this framing, Sullivan admired the musical brilliance, but staff accounts suggest he maintained a colder professional distance with Brown compared to guests he genuinely trusted. That separation matters because Sullivan booked entertainers for families, not clubs, and Brown's reputation was not just about ego, it was about harm. And from here, the countdown only gets darker, because the next legend isn't simply accused of violence behind the scenes. His control and abuse became one of the most notorious stories in music history. Number 3. Ike Turner, the architect of musical and personal terror. Number 3 takes us into one of the most infamous relationships in music history, because what the public saw on stage was lightning, but what was happening offstage, Tina Turner later revealed, was something closer to captivity. When Ike and Tina Turner appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, they delivered exactly what Sullivan's audience wanted: energy, precision, and a performance so powerful, it still gets described as one of the most electrifying moments in the show's history. Their rendition of Proud Mary became a signature example of what made them great: Tina's unstoppable stage presence and Ike's tight, controlled direction. But backstage accounts suggest Sullivan noticed something that the average viewer couldn't. People who worked around the show later described a cold dynamic behind the bright choreography. Ike wasn't just the band leader. He controlled everything: the band, the arrangements, the decisions, and most importantly, Tina herself. Staff members claimed Sullivan wasn't fooled by the polished routine. The way Ike watched Tina, the way he tracked her movements, and the way he carried himself around her, it reportedly made Sullivan uneasy. According to these accounts, Sullivan's attitude toward the couple reflected that discomfort. He was said to be warm toward Tina, but noticeably distant with Ike. That kind of separation mattered, because Ike had a reputation in the industry for needing control, even credit, even attention, and Sullivan allegedly went out of his way to compliment Tina directly, bypassing Ike in a way that insiders recognized as intentional. And the reason this matters is because what Sullivan's staff believed they were seeing backstage eventually became public knowledge. Tina Turner escaped the relationship in 1976 and later told the world what the marriage had really been like. In her autobiography I, Tina, and later in the film What's Love Got to Do with It, Tina described years of abuse, fear, and violence. She described being beaten, being forced to keep performing while injured, and living under constant threat. The public had watched the act for years and assumed it was glamour. Tina's story made it clear that the glamour was a mask. That's why Ike Turner's name carries such a brutal weight. Yes, his musical contributions were real. Music historians often credit his 1951 recording Rocket 88 as the first rock and roll record, and his band direction shaped a sound that influenced what came after. But those achievements sit beside something that most people can't ignore once they know it: the documented reputation for abuse and control that permanently stained his legacy. In the competitor account, this is where Sullivan's role becomes important again. The idea isn't that Sullivan could stop what was happening behind closed doors. He couldn't. What he could do was create distance, refuse to reward Ike with personal praise, and quietly communicate disapproval in the limited ways that a television host could. So number 3 stands out because it shows something chilling. The abuse wasn't a rumor that surfaced decades later. Tina's story turned it into public fact. But staff accounts suggest the signs were there early, and people who saw behind the curtain knew something was wrong even while the crowd was cheering. And now the countdown shifts again. Because number 2 isn't a slow-revealed horror story. It was a scandal so explosive it collapsed a rock career overnight, and it exposed a behavior pattern that would only get uglier as the years went on. Number 2, Jerry Lee Lewis, the killer's darkest secret. Number 2 is one of the most scandalous collapses in music history, because this wasn't a rumor that took years to surface. It was a truth that hit like a bomb, and once people found out, there was no way to unhear it. Jerry Lee Lewis was one of the earliest monsters of rock and roll in terms of raw talent and raw energy. His pounding piano, wild stage style, and songs like Whole Lot of Shakin' Goin' On and Great Balls of Fire made him look like the future. Fans called him the Killer, and for a brief moment he was positioned as a rival to Elvis, someone who could sit on the same throne. But less than a year after he became a national sensation, the entire image was destroyed. During a UK tour, the British press uncovered the shocking truth. The 22-year-old Jerry Lee Lewis had married his cousin Myra Gale Brown, and she was 13 years old. Even worse, Lewis had lied about her age, claiming she was 15, which was still disturbing, but sounded slightly less criminal to the public. Once the real number was known, it became one of the most explosive scandals early rock and roll had ever seen. And in your competitor script's framing, this is where Ed Sullivan's judgment comes in. Sullivan's show was built around the idea of respectability. If staff accounts are accurate, Sullivan didn't simply see this as a rock star mistake. He saw it as something fundamentally immoral. the kind of behavior that made him feel personally betrayed, because he believed the platform he gave artists was a kind of public approval. So when the scandal broke, the story goes that Sullivan wanted nothing more to do with him. The backlash was immediate. Lewis's career in America collapsed almost overnight. Radio stations stopped playing him. Venues canceled shows. The money dried up. In the competitor account, this is when you see how brutally the industry could turn, because Lewis went from earning massive appearance fees to taking a fraction of what he once commanded. He did eventually rebuild a career, mostly through country music, but the mainstream trajectory was never the same. That scandal became permanent. Every comeback came with that shadow. And what makes Jerry Lee Lewis even darker is what the competitor script emphasizes next. The scandal didn't stand alone. It was the first public sign of a bigger pattern. Lewis's personal life became a mess of instability, substance abuse, and violence allegations. The competitor script highlights that his marriages were surrounded by claims of abuse, and it points to 2 deaths that raised questions and added to the sense that tragedy followed him closely. His 4th wife, Jaren Pate, drowned in a swimming pool in 1982, shortly before their divorce was finalized. Then came another devastating headline. His 5th wife, Sean Michelle Stevens, died of a methadone overdose only 77 days after they married in 1983. Those facts alone created a grim portrait, and over time they fed into a darker reputation. Even when the music world praised his influence, there was always another story attached to his name, another allegation, another moment where violence and chaos seemed to win. That's why Jerry Lee Lewis lands at number 2, not because he wasn't brilliant. He absolutely was. The piano style, the showmanship, the fire in his performances, it shaped what rock and roll became. But his story also shows how a career can be built on shock and danger, and then eventually become trapped inside it. And now we reach number 1. Because number 1 is the only case in this list where the danger isn't just a scandal, and isn't just an abusive dynamic. It ends with the ultimate crime, the kind of outcome that makes everything else feel like it was building toward something inevitable. Number 1, Phil Spector. The sound of genius and madness. Number 1 is the darkest case on this list. Not because of an ugly scandal or a destructive relationship, but because it ends with the most extreme outcome possible. Phil Spector was a musical genius. He shaped pop history from behind the scenes, building a reputation as the mastermind of the wall of sound production style, and helping create hits for groups like the Ronettes, the Crystals, and the Righteous Brothers. Even if the average viewer didn't recognize his face, the sound he built was everywhere in the 1960s. It didn't just influence artists, it influenced how music itself was recorded. But the same man who could build beautiful music also built a reputation for something far uglier. The competitor account emphasizes that Spector's control in the studio wasn't the normal level of perfectionism you'd expect from a demanding producer. It was obsessive, threatening, dominating. Stories followed him for years about intimidation, cruelty, and behavior that made people around him feel unsafe, especially women. And the most chilling example of that came through Ronnie Spector, the lead singer of the Ronettes and later his wife. She described a relationship where she was kept virtually imprisoned in his mansion, and she later claimed he threatened to kill her if she ever tried to leave. It wasn't a messy marriage in the tabloid sense. It was fear, control, and isolation. In the competitor framing, this is why Sullivan's judgment about Spector feels so prescient. Spector didn't appear on the Ed Sullivan Show as a performer, but he was still part of the show's ecosystem because acts connected to his music and production were everywhere. Staff accounts claim Sullivan distrusted him as a person and thought there was something deeply wrong with him, something darker than arrogance or fame. And the years that followed only made that darkness clearer. Spector's behavior became more erratic. Reports circulated about him pulling guns on artists during recording sessions, including major names like John Lennon, Leonard Cohen, and the Ramones. At that point, it wasn't just eccentric genius stories anymore, it was violence, intimidation, and unpredictability with real weapons involved. Then came the moment that sealed his legacy forever. In 2003, actress Lana Clarkson was shot and killed at Spector's mansion. The case ended with Spector being convicted of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 19 years to life in prison. He died in 2021, still carrying the weight of that conviction. That's why Spector becomes number 1. With the other legends on this list, you can still see fans trying to separate the art from the person by arguing over context, debating rumors, or focusing only on the music. With Spector, there is no debate about the end result. A life was taken, a murder conviction remains, and the contrast becomes unbearable. A man who created some of the most emotionally uplifting pop music ever recorded also became capable of the ultimate violence. So if you're looking for the clearest example of talent covering darkness, Spector is it. And when you step back and look at this entire countdown, this is what the Ed Sullivan era forces us to confront. Sullivan Show was built on the idea of bringing entertainers into America's living rooms as trusted guests. In that world, talent wasn't the only standard. Character mattered too, even if the public didn't always see what was happening behind the curtain. Now, in just a moment, we'll tie this all together with what these 7 cases reveal about Sullivan's role as America's cultural gatekeeper, and why the question he faced is still the same question we struggle with today. How much should personal conduct matter when the art is unforgettable? Ed Sullivan spent years as America's most powerful gatekeeper, deciding who deserved a place in millions of homes every Sunday night. And whether every private judgment was fair or not, this list shows one thing clearly. Talent can be unforgettable, but character can still leave a trail that history doesn't ignore. These 7 legends helped shape music as we know it, but their personal conduct ranged from disturbing to criminal, and it forces a difficult truth. Sometimes the darkest stories happen far away from the stage lights. If you enjoyed this deep dive into entertainment history's most controversial legends, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next one. And let me know in the comments which name on this list shocked you the most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.